Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the AFCA webcast on conciliation. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this building stands and respectfully recognise elders past, present and future. We have over 1,200 registered participants for today's webcast, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Well, let me introduce our panel for today. To my far right, we have Alexandra Sidoti. Alexandra is a team manager in the investments and advice space at AFCA. She's also a former conciliator and has been with FOS and AFCA for 8 years now. To my right, we have San Lam. San is a current AFCA conciliator and she's a former case manager in the general insurance space. San's been at AFCA and its predecessor scheme FOS for 4 years now. And my name is Julian Hughes. I'm the team manager of the conciliation team. I'm a former case manager in the banking and finance space, and I've been at AFCA now for 5 years. I'll just go through a bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you experience some technical difficulties today, at any time during the webcast, please call technical support. Their details are provided on the screen there in the top left. If we refer to a resource being available during today's webcast, they will be available in the resource library, and that button is at the bottom right of your screen. At any point today in the webcast, you can submit a question via the Ask a Question button at the bottom right of your screen. The second half of today's webcast is dedicated to answering your questions, and also so that you know, today's webcast will be recorded and uploaded on the AFCA website within the next few days. Well, turning to the agenda, the webcast today is designed to give you an overview of conciliation at AFCA and give you the opportunity to ask some questions. The agenda is on your screen now and will cover the following topics. What's a conciliation at AFCA? Why do we conciliate? How do we conduct a conciliation? What happens after a conciliation? We'll talk about a case study. We'll introduce the AFCA conciliators, and we'll talk about what conciliation resources are available going forward. I'd like to pass off to San at this stage.
Thanks, Julian. Hi, everyone. I'm San Lam, and I'm in AFCA's Investigation and Resolution Group's Support and Allocations team as a conciliator. In this section, I will be talking about what an AFCA conciliation is and where conciliation fits in the process. So what is a conciliation conference? It's a guided telephone conversation in which the parties can talk about the complaint in an open and informal way between the complainant, the financial firm, an AFCA conciliator or caseworker. Most conciliations take place over the phone, but in some special circumstances, they may also be face-to-face. Most conciliation conferences take between 1 to 2 hours, but they may take longer and participants can ask for a break at any time. So conciliation is one of the methods we use to resolve complaints at the case management stage in our AFCA process. So this is now on your screens, a little after the registration and referral stage and before a decision stage. We have had some pre-submitted questions about how we decide whether a complaint is suitable for conciliation. As a starting point, we will consider all complaints are suitable for conciliation, and then we will consider the circumstances case by case, the parties to the complaint, whether there's any red flags being raised against conciliation. But our survey results have shown that in terms of statistics, complaints that go to conciliation have a greater overall satisfaction from their participants than those that do not have a conciliation conference conducted. But we'll get into that a little later in the webcast. We also have a pre-submitted question asking whether conciliation is compulsory. And in general, if a complainant has agreed to participate in a conciliation, then we will usually conduct a conciliation conference unless there are exceptional reasons or circumstances as to why the financial firm should not participate. Keeping in mind changes in legislation, we would like to see cooperation from financial firms And in this space, we would like to see a willingness from financial firms to participate in conciliations. In short, there must be compelling reasons why you would not participate in a specific case. And for example, this is really the rule rather than the exception, and it is rare, and it might be meaningful for us to go through previous circumstances with you, and if there are specific reasons, then put it to us and we'll consider them. So why did AFCA include conciliation as part of the complaint resolution process? So in this section, we'll be looking at the impact of the the complaint resolution process, the benefits of conciliation, and focusing in on interest-based complaint resolution. Before we talk about the benefits of a conciliation, it makes sense to look at the impact of the complaint resolution process and what it can have. And ASIC has released a report that's quite informative and vital called Report 603, The Consumer Journey Through the Internal Dispute Resolution Process of Financial Service Providers. And a PDF copy is available on our resources tab in this webcast. Now, financial firms are impacted by the complaint resolution process in two main areas: reputation and resources. One of the key findings in the ASIC report was that the impact on financial firms' sentiment for those with a complaint in IDR is that it found there's a direct correlation between the length of time a complaint took to resolve and an increased negative sentiment toward the financial firm. 69% of complainants whose IDR process lasted more than 45 days felt that the process had a negative impact on their perception of the financial firm. And the impact for the financial firm's resourcing would include staffing, systems, time, and cost. And there is one word to describe the impact on consumers: stressful. The ASIC report found that 35% of complainants reported high to very high levels of stress if the complaint was resolved within the first day of the IDR process. So when a complaint remains unresolved for more than 42 days, the number jumps up to 73% of complainants reporting high to very high levels of stress. 81% of complainants say that they experienced obstacles within the IDR process, and these can include not being heard or listened to, not being taken seriously, and unable to get anything done. So how does conciliation help? So the process is fast and effective. The aim is to try and resolve the complaint by agreement on the day. It's also an effective way for everyone to better understand the issues and the circumstances in the complaint. And we also address the perceived obstacles in the complaint processes. It also allows parties to speak to each other. All parties report high levels of satisfaction, 91.3% positive experience overall from complainants and financial firms in February 2019 in terms of this. Now, on your screen, you'll see a interest-based complaint resolution model, and this is where we're trying to tell you we consider the parties' interests and not just their needs. And you'll see that represented by the diagram on the right, where the needs may not be seen and they're underlying the surface. So it's an opportunity, conciliation, for parties to be heard and to explore what is not being said. This is represented in the diagram on the slide, and like I said, the interests under the surface. It also rebuilds relationships and improves negative perceptions. To wrap up, I want to stress that conciliation is an opportunity to change the message and empower the parties to come to their own agreement outside of the AFCA process. When we listen, reflect, apologise, and promise improvement, it can have a ripple effect in a person's life and also change how they perceive the financial firm in the future. I'll now pass over to Alexandra to speak about the next section.
Okay, thank you, San. Hello everyone, I'm, as Julian said earlier, Alexandra Sidoti. I'm a conciliator in a former life, currently working as a team manager in the investments and advice space. What I'm going to be talking about in this section is how we conduct a conciliation. I'll be looking at what the conciliator's role is, what's really expected of you as parties. I'll go through the conciliation model that we use as well, which is very closely modelled on the Resolution Institute model of mediation, and talk a bit about how you can get the best out of the process and what types of outcomes we often see from conciliation. So first of all, what is the conciliator's role? Before the conciliation conference, the conciliator or the caseworker who's handling the complaint will contact both the complainant and the financial firm to discuss the complaint. They'll go through the conciliation process with you, so you've got a really good idea of what to expect. That's also a really good opportunity to ask any questions that you might have about the process, about what might be covered and things like that. The conciliator or the caseworker at that time will also arrange and confirm a date and time for the conciliation conference. We did have a pre-submitted question asking if an agenda can be provided prior to a conciliation conference. The short answer to that is no, although when you're having that chat with the caseworker or conciliator prior, it's a really good opportunity to discuss the sorts of things that might be covered in the conference. The reason we don't provide a formal agenda prior to the conference is really because the focus is to enable the parties to be heard, and because it sometimes brings out different things that don't necessarily come across in the written submissions. So we really want to be hearing from the parties in the conference before we box ourselves into a particular agenda. Sometimes they can be pretty predictable anyway, and it might be no different to what you discussed with the caseworker prior. But just in case new things come up, we want to be flexible to that in the conference itself and making sure we're responding to exactly what's heard. During the conference, the conciliator will really be managing the opening statements, the reflection and agenda setting. The conciliator will be assisting in the joint discussion and issues exploration, so they'll be asking a lot of open questions at that stage and trying to encourage direct communication between the parties. And the conciliator will also be deciding when we will be having individual sessions, how to conduct the process, whether we're doing a shuttle negotiation or not, and then facilitating the closure of the conference. So what you can see up on your screen now is the Resolution Institute's model of mediation diamond. If there's one thing that you take away from today, I'd really encourage you to print a copy of that slide. If there's one thing that you want to bring to a conciliation conference with you, this is sort of everything that's happening in a nutshell. The main thing that I would like to draw your attention to is that real past-future access that you can see on the side of the diamond there. It gives you a really good idea of the flow of the conference as a whole. So you will see that the first stage of the conference is very much focused on the past. So there we will be looking at what's happened, what people's different perspectives are on what has happened, and try to, unpack that and explore it further. Once we hit to the middle of the diamond, that wide point where we're at individual sessions, that's when we'll be really kind of more at the present. We'll be checking in at that point and saying, okay, where's everyone at right now? How do they feel about the discussions that have been had so far? And then start to think about, okay, where might we and how might we move forward? So that latter half of the conference is when we're looking to the future and we're looking at what different options might be for resolving the complaint. If we look like we're getting towards an agreement, really sort of future-proofing and testing that agreement. And the reason that I really draw your attention to that axis in particular is because there can be concerns sometimes, I think, from both parties that we're spending too much time in the past or that we're going over ground that we've been over before. So please, I'd encourage you to very much trust your conciliator and to trust that there is really good sound research and experience behind why we focus on the past before moving to the future. As you go through the diamond, it gives you a really clear idea of the whole structure of the conference. It tells you exactly what's happening when. So at the very beginning, there'll be the conciliator's opening statement that outlines the process in and of itself. We'll then have the parties' opening statements. Now, the parties' opening statements are really an opportunity for the parties to speak without interruption on the complaint in a nutshell from their perspective. It's not a time to have a lot of back and forth. It's really so everyone can get a clear, uninterrupted look at how each party sees things at that point in time. The conciliator will then reflect both parties' summaries, and that's to really make sure that we have properly heard and understood what has been said. We'll be checking in with the parties at that stage, so if there's anything that you've left out or feel the need to add, you'll get the opportunity to do that. From there, the conciliator will set the agenda. The agenda topics are always trying to be very mutual and neutral, is what we say. So to really draw from the opening statements key themes that we need to address that cover both sides. So we try not to have agenda items that will be very much focused on one party and not the other. We're trying to capture those themes that are really of concern to both parties and bring them in that way. Once we've set the agenda, that will then really guide the joint session and the exploration of issues. As you can see on the diamond, that's a very wide point in the conference. We will spend probably most of our time in the issues exploration. We really find that the more information that we can get out and get on the table at that time, whether it's about what people are thinking or what they're feeling, or trying to perspective check and get different understandings of how each other are looking at things, the more that we get out at that time, the more that we have to work with later on when we're trying to build a resolution or see what options going forward might look like. So the conciliator at that time will be asking a lot of questions, but as much as possible, they'll also be really trying to encourage and facilitate direct communication between the parties. It's not supposed to be a formal thing where each party remains very positional. We're wanting to encourage a dialogue and really speak very openly about the complaint at that time. After the exploration of issues, as you can see, we move to what's labelled on this diamond as private sessions. We call them individual sessions, and that's largely because confidentiality works a bit differently in our model. They're not, as we say at the beginning of our conferences, it's not strictly confidential. If people raise something in the individual session that is new and relevant information that would have an impact on a final outcome or decision, we'll talk to you about whether that's information that should really be shared with the other party to help us work towards resolution. The individual sessions are really also where we do a lot of reality testing. So I think sometimes both parties can be concerned that the conciliator's sort of sitting back and asking a lot of questions, but not really letting them know where this sits within the AFCA approach. That's the time when the conciliator will really do that. It's not a mediation model which is purely facilitative. It's a conciliation model, which means there is a bit more of an advisory element to it. And what we're really giving people information on at that time is what is the AFCA approach to some of the issues that might have been raised. Sometimes issues can be so unique that we don't have a set AFCA approach, but we can certainly give people a lot of information about how AFCA looks at similar sorts of issues and the sorts of things that may come up, or what different turning points on the complaint might be if it does go through to decision. We often describe it as sort of shining a torch. So we're trying to shine a torch on what different options might look like going forward, one of which is a decision space. But as San said earlier, we're dealing very much in interest-based negotiation. So we're not looking only at the rights and what a decision might look like. We're trying to flesh out what different people's interests are and what different ways might be of addressing those underlying interests. After that, on the diamond, it says that we then move into a joint negotiation. Now, the conciliator is really going to call that on the day. And again, I encourage you to really have a lot of trust in the experience and expertise of your conciliator in making these judgment calls. It may be that we come into a joint session and have a negotiation. It may be that the conciliator conducts more of a shuttle negotiation between the parties. You can see again there on the diamond that there's then an opportunity for further individual sessions. That's there and it's always an option in the process. To be perfectly honest, in most instances we don't find there's a need for further individual sessions after we've had that negotiation stage. We'll move into a final joint session where we either look at, okay, what options do we have to reach a resolution? If we're reaching a resolution, what does it look like? The conciliator will work really hard to reality test any resolution as well, to really try to future-proof it and make sure that we're not reaching an outcome that's only going to lead to a whole new complaint on a different issue further down the track. We'll work out the terms of agreement and do the closure at that time. If the complaint does not resolve, the conciliator will then be able to give all of the parties some further information on what the next steps in the process will be. Okay, so that's the diamond. Take it with you. Going on next to look at what's expected of you in a conciliation. So I think this is really divided into two categories, as you can see on your screen. It's what's expected of you prior and what's expected on the day. What's expected prior is a lot of really clear housekeeping stuff that if you don't do, sort of comes out one way or another in the conference. And the danger of being unprepared for a conference is that it can be really clear to the other party and it can throw us off from the very beginning. It can either make one party feel overwhelmed and intimidated or feel that the process isn't being taken seriously. So that's always something to keep in mind when you're looking at your preparation. So be across what the key issues are. If you've had some thoughts about potential solutions, we'll make sure you do put thought into that. I'd encourage people to try not to be too wedded to solutions before going in. We really do want to keep an open mind. Sometimes it surprises us what might resolve a particular complaint. But if you've got some ideas ahead of time of what solutions might look like, it's definitely beneficial. And if that's the case, to make sure you also have authority to resolve the complaint on that basis. So if there are other people that you need to speak to, either internally in the business at a financial firm or for complainants and consumer representatives, that you've got instructions from everyone that you need to, including other people who might be impacted behind the scenes, sons, daughters, wives, husbands, all of that. Make sure everyone's on board and on the same page. Be across key documents and correspondence. Also, please, this is a big one, make sure that you have booked a quiet place to do the conciliation without any distractions. Again, if that doesn't happen on the day, it can really throw things off quite early. Make sure things like your phone and equipment is all in order, that you've had it checked beforehand, and very, very importantly, please make sure that you've sent the correct contact number through to the conciliator or the caseworker prior to the conference. It's something that often causes conferences to start late, and then people get more nervous, everything gets a bit rattled, and we can often lose some of our momentum early. So that's a big thing for prior. On the day, be there to participate at the arranged time, be in the quiet space with no distractions. More than anything, please be prepared to speak very openly. Come with an open mind. All right. Getting the best out of the process. So I've said this before, but I'll say it one more time again. Please trust your conciliator. One of the big mantras that we have is that you control the content, but the conciliator controls the process. So the parties can put absolutely any content that they would like on the table. Sometimes there are things that seem external to the complaint, but for whatever reason is obviously relevant to that party. We encourage you to bring that onto the table, and it may be something unexpected that assists us in reaching a resolution later. But please do let the conciliator control the process. Sometimes parties can be a bit frustrated if they feel that things aren't moving as quickly as they would like them to, or that we're covering ground that's already been covered. Please rest assured that in all likelihood the conciliator has a reason for why they're going over that ground again. And it may be that one of the parties keeps coming back to something which tends to indicate that they don't really feel heard on that, or that there's something else there that sort of is niggling at them. Do your homework. So, like I said earlier, that's really being across the documents and the correspondence, having thought about potential options beforehand and having got any relevant authority. Really think about who's attending the process. So part of that, I think, is to think very carefully about how things appear to the person on the other end of the phone. So if you've got somebody who's highly emotive about the complaint and is going to be who is going to be escalating things rather than resolving things, then maybe think about how necessary it is to have them involved. If you've got a lot of people that you want to have, often this happens more with financial firms. Sometimes we have people from different areas of the business wanting to attend at different levels. I'd just encourage you to be really conscious of how that might appear to somebody who may be on their own on the other end of the phone. And they could then feel quite overwhelmed and intimidated. And if that's the case, the reality is they're more likely to be nervous, they feel on the back foot. The more uncomfortable someone is, the less likely they're going to be in a space where they're actually able to make decisions to resolve the complaint. More importantly than anything, approach the conciliation wholeheartedly. So when we say that, it's really about trying not to be too positional. You've done your homework beforehand, you're across the documents, you know what your thoughts and feelings are on it at this stage, but keep an open mind. It may be that there's something there that's been said before but you haven't quite heard, or you haven't quite understood, or you've slightly got the wrong end of the stick. Please come just being ready to listen to all of those things. There could be brand new things that come out on the day, and sometimes it's the things that shift, small bits of information that can shift things ever so slightly, and that's where we get a whole new resolution or a whole new course of action that could come out of it. Last but not least, please think before you speak. And it's going to the same point of trying not to be too positional. I know it's hard sometimes. You feel like, you're in dispute and someone's saying something and you're getting your answer ready before they've finished speaking. Allow them to finish speaking. Really think about what they've said and take the time to think about how you want to respond directly to what they've said. And the conciliator will give you that time. Finally, we'll have a quick look at types of outcomes from conciliation, but let me say, this is a very non-exhaustive list. The types of outcomes that you can reach in conciliation really are limited only by the parties' imaginations. We encourage you to be creative. Sometimes the best resolutions that we get do come a bit out of left field, and it's, as San said, really looking to the interests sometimes that are going on, the underlying interests going on in a dispute, rather than just, the rights-based positional arguments. It could be, really random things that when you're listening underneath to what's driving someone, it could be something quite different that really resolves the complaint for them. You can see some sort of examples up here on the screen. I won't go through them all. They give you a bit of an idea of some of the things that we do see. When we're looking at timetabling, I should say that's really looking at things like sometimes general insurance complaints. There might be complex building disputes where we look at setting out a timetable of a way forward. Don't tweet me. It's an emerging thing that we see where there are issues on social media and things like that. By all means, you can build things like that into your agreement if that is something that can then resolve the complaint for both sides. On that though, let me be very clear that if that's not part of the agreement that has been actively reached and agreed to by both parties, it's not something that you can really slip into a deed of settlement later on. So be mindful of things like that. Whatever you're looking to put into a deed should be openly agreed to between both parties. But we see a lot of things like explanations and apologies in particular, as being very powerful. All right, and I'll hand it back over to San.
Thanks, Alexandra. Now, in this section, we'll be looking at what happens after a conciliation conference. So we're looking at the AFCA process after a conciliation occurs, what happens to information that's disclosed during a conciliation, and a brief case study to give you an example. So as you can see on your screen now, we do have a map of the process for when an agreement is reached during a conciliation conference and when it's not. So when an agreement is reached, AFCA will create an audio recording of the agreement and provide confirmation in writing to both parties afterwards. Now, sometimes financial firms will prepare their own settlement documents for the complainant to sign. We will usually discuss that if it's required during the conciliation conference, and we would expect that the terms would reflect the agreement reached during the conciliation conference. If complainants have any concerns about the wording of agreements, then they have the time to contact us 7 days after the conference, as after this, the complaint is closed. In terms of the enforceability of the agreement, it's like any contract or agreement in business and the enforceability of that. And we would expect both parties to comply with the terms of the agreement. Now, if the agreement is not reached, we move over to the AFCA process, and AFCA may continue to negotiate, and if the negotiations are unsuccessful, then it is likely that we will investigate the complaint further. In some cases, we may be able to give parties an indication during the conciliation conference of what the outcome might be if our investigation of the complaint is completed. In other cases, we might ask the parties for more information. This may be revealed during the conciliation conference before we can make a decision about the complaint. And the AFCA caseworker will be managing this aspect of the complaint. We've received a pre-submitted question about how long after a conciliation can a recommendation or a remedy be expected. Now, I have to say it depends case by case. So complaints vary in their complexity, and so it also depends on whether further information is required resulting from discussions during a conciliation conference. It also depends on when the complaint was lodged, as complaints are handled in order of lodgement. But this is a discussion piece between the complainant or all the financial firms and the caseworker handling the matter. So obviously if there's more information required, then it will take a little bit more time than if there isn't before a preliminary assessment or a recommendation can be provided, or if necessary, a determination. So what happens to information disclosed at a conciliation? Our conciliation conferences at AFCA cannot be recorded, but if a complainant and financial firm reach a resolution and resolve the complaint, we will make a recording of what was agreed. If the complaint can't be resolved at the conciliation, we may use some of the information disclosed if we go on to consider the complaint further. And this can include new information or relevant information discussed and the areas of agreement reached during the conciliation. We want to be clear and transparent about this. We record notes of everything during the conciliation conference on the file. And the reason why is because we aim to obtain all information that might not have been clearly put or articulated in writing previously in written submissions. Everything in the AFCA process is without prejudice to any future legal proceedings. So to be clear, this means that anything during the conciliation conference may be used during the AFCA process. And this is mentioned in a statement by the conciliator at the beginning of every conference. In terms of the discussions during an individual session with a party, we still want to have a frank conversation with you. So what we record and share is any new and relevant information. Now we'll look at a case study as we've had some pre-submitted questions about, for examples of our complaints that we see in conciliation. And one question asked, what are the top 10 complaints we see? Unfortunately, we won't have the time to go through all 10, but this case study is an example of a complaint to give you an idea. So this complaint was about a complainant who received collection letters from the bank, even though he was not in default, and he continued to receive the letters for 18 months. As it turns out, someone in his state with the same name and same year of birth was in default in their lending obligations. So the complainant tried to contact the bank to clear up the confusion, but he couldn't pass the security questionnaire. And the complainant attempted to resolve the complaint with the bank directly for 18 months and during the IDR process without success before coming to AFCA and lodging his complaint with AFCA. So the complaint remained unresolved during the initial stages at AFCA. However, at the conciliation conference, The right person from the bank was there and was the first person who could listen and acknowledge and was able to do things that the complainant was asking for, for example, agreeing to stop sending the letters. The bank's representative admitted the bank's mistake and also agreed that they could correct the bank's records. And in compensation, the bank also paid the complainant $3,000 for the stress and inconvenience he had suffered for over the last 18 months. And in an effort to restore the customer's confidence in the bank offered to pay him $500 for every letter incorrectly sent to him in the future. This is a great example of where we have the right people in the room at Conciliation and we're able to address the obstacles of not being heard previously. I'll now hand back to Julian to finish us off.
Thanks, Anne. Well, in this section, we will meet the AFCA Conciliation team. We'll talk a bit about the AFCA Conciliation Skills Accreditation Program, and we'll tell you about some conciliation resources that are available for you and complainants out there. So, on screen now, you've got a short bio for all of the current AFCA conciliators. There are 7 conciliators at AFCA at the moment. Most of the conciliators you can see there come from a private legal practice background, and most have previously been at AFCA in a case manager or case analyst role as well. We do have some of our conciliators coming from a counselling background or a statutory decision maker role as well. And all of those, I can certainly say, are very experienced and experts in this field. So we've had a question, some pre-submitted questions about conflicts, about whether it's appropriate for caseworkers to conduct conciliations, and the benefits and the takeaways from caseworkers conducting conciliations themselves. It's a really good question. In short, there is no conflict between the role that a case manager plays in a conciliation itself and in their further involvement in the matter. The caseworker isn't the ultimate decision maker, and that's why we have ombudsmen at AFCA who issue those decisions. From our perspective and in our experience, we see a lot more benefit for caseworkers conducting their own conciliations than not. And the reasons for that are that our caseworkers are trained experts in the process. They can benefit from hearing the parties' concerns themselves and really getting the chance to connect with the parties and make sure they understand what is going on with the complaint. The parties equally benefit from having the conciliator involved. They can be heard, but equally perhaps know that the caseworker has heard and understands them and knows where to go with the complaint and what to do next. As we've talked about and touched on, the feedback we get is overwhelmingly positive from both complainants and from financial firms. You are telling us that you're enjoying this process, and so are your clients. The other reason is we want to make sure that we're increasing the number of conciliations that we're conducting. The more people that are doing these conciliations, the more that we can deliver this service. And it also has other benefits in terms of being able to arm caseworkers with the ability to exercise those skills in negotiation that are really valuable at other stages in the process. So I'd like to touch on how do we make sure the caseworkers are conducting the best conciliations they can to the parties. And what we're doing here is, in a word, is we run something called the Conciliation Skills Accreditation Program at AFCA. The conciliation team oversees that program. And what it involves is taking caseworkers who have completed a 4-day mediation skills course that's run by Resolution Institute, where they learn about that the Resolution Institute Diamond that Alexandra spoke about before. What they then do is they observe a conciliation with the conciliator. They'll co-conciliate with the conciliator as a team, and eventually they'll work up to conciliating on their own with the conciliator observing. Once the conciliation team is satisfied that the caseworker is able to conduct conciliations on their own, we will sign them off as being accredited. got some numbers there about the number of staff who have been through the mediation skills course. More than 200 have completed that 4-day course that's run by Resolution Institute. 70 AFCA staff have been accredited overall, and that doesn't include the financial difficulty space, where we have 20 caseworkers in financial difficulty teams who are conducting their own conciliations as well. 51 existing caseworkers in the banking and finance, general insurance, investment in advice, and life space and superannuation space are currently conducting their own conciliations. There's 25 in banking and finance, 17 in general insurance, 8 in investments, advice and life, and 1 in superannuation. Turning now to the conciliation resources that are available, we've received some pre-submitted questions about what information is out there about the process. So first of all, you can go to our website, and this will also appear in the resources tab on your screen today. Our fact sheet, Attending a Conciliation Conference, gives a good summary of everything that you will need to know and about the process, and gives you some of the tools that you can use going into a conciliation itself. We've got a brochure, a guide to conciliation conferences. Now that is geared mostly to complainants, so please feel free to refer that on, and that's available for everyone on our website there. This webcast is being recorded, and if you can also direct people to have a look at that webcast. It's on the website there in the middle of your screen. Alternatively, just ask. So you can ask your AFCA caseworker or debrief with the conciliator on the day if you have any questions about the conciliation process, and we're happy to help. Well, we've reached that time where we address some of the questions that have been coming through. They have been coming through thick and fast today, so we'll try to answer as many as we can. Starting with a few of the pre-submitted questions. We'll only be addressing questions about conciliation at AFCA during this session, and any questions about specific cases we'll follow up with. We can follow up with you directly. Please let your caseworker or conciliator know about those. And if you have any questions, feel free at this stage to send them through now. Okay, let's get started. Perhaps one of the first questions that came through, and it's a really good question, and maybe I'll direct it to Alexandra, is what are some of the common roadblocks during conciliation, and what can financial firms do to assist getting through those roadblocks for us?
Yeah, sure. That is a good question. I think some of the key roadblocks that we see, one big one is jumping to resolution offers too early. We will sometimes see that they're going, we've got this great resolution, we're going to, let's not talk about everything, surely the other party should just accept this. And the conciliator will try as they might, as hard as they can to stop that from happening, but sometimes they just can't. I've never seen a time where that's really been effective. It often immediately shuts down the conference. The reason for that is, as we were saying earlier when we're looking at that past-future axis on the diamond, people do really need to be able to be heard, be properly understood, really explore everything that's happened before they're often in a position to properly consider offers. So you could have the exact same offer being very effective at the end of the conference and not at all effective at the beginning. So that's a big one. I think in addition to that, being too positional is a big one, and that goes for both parties. As we were saying earlier, we really do encourage people to approach the conciliation wholeheartedly. So if you're coming in too strong in your position and not really being there to listen and seek to understand, then that can also really close down the conference quite early.
Great, thanks for that, Alexandra. Well, Sam, we've got a question about whether financial firms and complainants can attempt to resolve a complaint before conciliation. I'm wondering if you can take us through how would we sort of approach that? Is that something that we would support?
Sure, yes. We are always encouraging parties to keep the lines of communication open between each other. And if there is an opportunity for early negotiations or early resolution, talking to the other party about it and possibly just avoiding having to go to conciliation, that's perfectly fine too. Obviously, it's helpful to keep AFCA involved and in the know of any kind of offers that are made to try and resolve things early. But it is always encouraged that parties do talk to each other, because if there's an opportunity to finalise a matter before a conciliation is scheduled, then that obviously is great for the parties involved. Obviously, you know, a complainant and a financial firm has to put their resources into attending the conciliation conference along with AFCA. So it's a matter for the parties if they choose to do so, and we would encourage them to talk to each other.
Great, thanks for that, Sam. Someone's asked about whether AFCA would consider conciliation as part of the fast track process that we have. We're always looking to improve our processes, and we want to make sure that we're delivering the service to as many people as we can is the starting point on that. At the moment, this isn't part of the fast track process, but if that's something that you would like to see more, please send through your feedback, and it's certainly something that we would consider, even if in a modified form.
Yeah.
One question for perhaps Alexandra. Someone's asked about whether we would conduct a conciliation if a matter has been previously considered by a predecessor scheme, like the SCT, or the CIO, or FOS.
Okay. That's a good question. It's largely a jurisdictional question, really. So, as San was saying earlier, where conciliation sits in our process is really at the case management stage. So once something's been registered, it's gone through referral and workflow, it'll then end up with a particular team, and that's where we have conciliation. The question of whether something's been considered by a predecessor scheme will have been dealt with prior to it reaching that stage. So if it's determined that something's already been dealt with by a predecessor scheme, so that could be there's been a negotiated or conciliated outcome that's been agreed to by a predecessor scheme, or there's been a recommendation or a determination issued that's considered previously dealt with, and it won't then even proceed to case management. So there won't be that opportunity then to have a conciliation conference, unless for whatever reason both parties are in agreement that we should be considering it going forward. And if both parties agree and still want the complaint to be heard regardless, then it's unusual, but something we could always consider. But largely, it's a jurisdictional issue that will have been dealt with prior.
Great, thanks. We've had a question about who can come along to a conciliation, and San, I'm wondering if you can talk about, first of all, can financial firms bring an observer along? And second of all, can representatives attend with a complainant or on behalf of a complainant? So first on that point about an observer.
Yes, so financial firms do sometimes bring observers to conciliations, and that's fine. And Alexandra touched on this before, think about the number of people who are attending those. So we're talking about one observer, that's fine. But if we're looking at more than one, then there really has to be a reason for the observer to be there, more than one person from the financial firm. Now, as to representatives for a complainant, of course, we encourage complainants to also attend if it's suitable for them, and for their representatives to attend on their behalf if necessary. So it's completely normal to have a representative as well as the complainant attend, and have one party or one person be the mouthpiece for that party. And obviously the conciliator will check in from time to time with the parties to see if anyone else wants to add or discuss any topics which haven't been touched on.
Great. And there is a question here, I suppose, about conflicts. It's an interesting one. Are any of AFCA employees employed or contracted to banks or financial institutions and pose a conflict of interest? I can say no, categorically no. No AFCA employees are currently employed that I'm aware of by firms. We have a robust conflicts policy at AFCA where you must declare any conflicts, especially employment. That would be very concerning for us. But even on things like ownership of shares in companies and that sort of thing, that's something that we keep an eye on. And it's very important to us that we maintain our independence, and we also maintain that view or the perception by all of our stakeholders that we are independent in how we conduct ourselves throughout our decision-making process.
Yeah, that's right. And even if somebody's been employed by a financial firm prior, obviously, when we're recruiting, industry experience is something that we can really look at. But if they've been with a particular financial firm, there will always be a period of time where they won't deal with any complaints in relation to that financial firm for an initial period until, everyone's comfortable that there can't be any issues or concerns.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks for that. Well, perhaps, Alexandra, can I pass to you for another question about, there's been a question about how long, perhaps, or maybe Sandy, you can address it, how long, if you can give an indication, and maybe you can't, can parties expect a preliminary assessment after a conciliation has been conducted?
Yeah, I think we touched on this a little bit earlier as well, and I did mention it is dependent on the case. So we will always look at it case by case, and different cases have different levels of complexity, and there might be different levels of information provided before a conciliation conference. And if the conciliation conference is not successful in resolving the complaint, then there's still an opportunity for AFCA to investigate the complaint further and to ask for further information. So it's all dependent on these factors in each individual case. So thinking about that, and also thinking about the parties involved and the caseworker involved, it's a conversation piece really between the parties and the caseworker, as opposed to the conciliator. We don't like to put timeframes on it, but we would like to see decisions made, obviously, in an effective and an efficient manner shortly after a conciliation conference, though.
Great. Okay. Alexandra, I'm wondering if you can let us know, we've had a question from somebody about whether any particular firms are better than others in approaching conciliation with an open mind, perhaps with managing their approach, maybe without naming names. Could you talk about if someone is concerned at a financial firm about their own approach and they're reflecting on their own approach, what are some of the things that they could do to improve that and make sure they're delivering the best service they can for their clients?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and yes, we do see some financial firms doing this a lot better than others. Sometimes it can really depend on how much training the individuals participating in conciliation have had at the financial firm. I think Julian mentioned earlier, we do really encourage people to get, training in mediation skills. So whether it's through the Resolution Institute or another provider, having that background is definitely a huge assistance and really changes how people participate. There are some financial firms who I think are not afraid of giving an apology, sometimes straight off the bat, or a really clear acknowledgement that maybe something's happened in a way that's less than ideal. You have other financial firms who I think are a bit fearful of that, but what we do really find is that the more open that you are with that sort of thing up front, it kind of opens up the whole conversation going forward a lot better. And we often find that those complaints are far more likely to resolve. So I think the main thing is get training if you can, but really try to encourage your staff in particular to be not too positional and to really engage in open listening is the main thing. Those that do that, those that are really hearing and listening to what the other party is saying, far more likely to resolve.
It's a great answer and a great question as well. It's always good to hear that self-reflection and making sure that people are checking in and making sure they're doing the best that they can to contribute in a conciliation
And
conference.
they can really ask the conciliator as well. If you or one of your staff finish a conciliation and think, well, gosh, that didn't go the way I thought it would, or it didn't go as well as I thought it would, ask for that direct feedback from the conciliator. They're experts in this area and they're more than happy to assist in pointers of even letting you know things that maybe fell a bit flat or didn't sound quite right. That goes for both parties, consumer reps as well. If there's something that maybe you don't realise just isn't working, ask your conciliator and they'll give you that feedback.
Great. Well, maybe I'll take this one. There's a question about whether a complainant can come back again with the same issue once it's resolved. Now, it sounds like there might be a specific case behind this one which we wouldn't comment on, but in terms of we have touched on the fact that resolution agreements are as enforceable as any other sort of agreement that is out there. If there is a breach of that agreement, in general, we'll be asking the parties to comply with that. Now, there is a special category of disputes which is worth touching on, which people might perceive that it's the same issue returning over and over again, and that's in regards to financial difficulty or financial hardship cases. Firms should be aware that their financial hardship obligations, at least in the credit space, are ongoing to their customers. So if a new circumstances arise of financial hardship, those should be considered at every stage. Well, San, there's a question about whether a view can be given, whether perhaps a preliminary assessment can be given in a conciliation. I'm wondering if you can address that.
Yes, so as part of the conciliation process, the conciliator's role is to facilitate the communication between the parties. But there is, obviously, when Alexandra was going through the model, there is a time for when there is reflection and also reality testing. And if necessary, then a view may be provided or an idea might be provided about how AFCA is likely to approach this complaint and any decision they might make after an investigation is completed. So there is that opportunity that caseworkers or conciliators during a conference may choose to do this, but it's on a case-by-case basis. Again, I do love going back to that, but it is so true. It just depends on the case. If we've got all the information that we need to make an informed decision as well, then that is an opportunity to occur probably during the conciliation conference at the latter stages of the conference, though, sometime between the individual discussions and, if necessary, a further joint discussion after individual discussions are done.
Great, thanks for that, Sam. So great questions, and as a reminder to everyone, the Ask a Question tab can be found in the top right of your screen within the dark blue hand icon. If you have any questions, please keep on firing through. We've got many more to address, but I'm sure there'll be more coming also. Now, there's a question here about the techniques that we can use when we're dealing with difficult or unreasonable parties. And maybe I can pass that to both of you. Alexandra, to start with, what are some of the techniques that we might use when we encounter a difficult or unreasonable complainant or a difficult or unreasonable representative from the financial firm?
Yeah, sure. So there are a few sort of tips and tricks, I suppose. One of the ones that I like is this concept of match, lead, follow. So sometimes if someone's speaking in a very escalated tone or a heightened tone, or maybe they're speaking very quickly or a little bit aggressively, if you kind of match their tone to start off with to get their attention, you can then lead them, you then step down a little bit and they will tend to follow you. It's sort of a well-researched tool that can be very effective. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I think it's very important to let people have their say. So if people want to really have a big long rant, sometimes it sounds like, I think it's good to let them go. And then you can also use silence very effectively. So rather than trying to interrupt or butt in, which is what that party is often expecting, often because that's what they've really experienced a lot in the past. If you really kind of feel the back of your chair, is what we say a lot, let them really completely run through and have a moment of silence. What works really well with that is then an invitation. So I think sometimes you'll find people are so caught in their story that they don't want to listen to things that could be of assistance. We've got a lot of information that we want to give parties about maybe what the other party is saying or some ideas that they've come up with, or our approach or our processes. I think people are far more willing to listen to that information if you give them the invitation and the choice to listen. So sometimes we'll say to people, we've spent a fair bit of time speaking about your concerns surrounding XYZ. I'm wondering if it would be useful for you if we spent a little bit of time talking about AFCA's approach to misrepresentation, or what sort of framework we tend to look at complaints of that nature in. I've never had someone say no. People always sort of take a deep breath and say, okay. And I think it's partly just signposting and flagging to shift mindset into a listening mode rather than the speaking mode.
Yeah. I think Alexandra has covered everything that I wanted to say. I really wanted to second the point that Alexandra made about how letting them vent and letting them speak and just sitting back and listening. Sometimes it has been a case of they've had this experience all the way through with their financial firm, or vice versa. A financial firm has not had the opportunity and they've not had the chance to say what they've wanted to say. This is an opportunity. It's a great opportunity for allowing both parties to speak and give them that platform to do so. And obviously, if it gets to a heated point, Alexandra's tips about letting them match or matching them and then leading them to follow you, it is such an effective tool. So it's always about taking the situation as it is and working with that. And I found it very useful to use those techniques as well in trying to bring things back to, I guess, a level playing field.
Yes. And another big one, I think, is reflection too. So sometimes people will go on and on and on and on and on because they're not confident that you've heard them. So reflecting back what they've said in a nutshell is a good way of giving someone a clear indicator, I have heard you. Sometimes they just need to know that and everything will de-escalate from there.
That's right. And we often get that feedback, well, no one's put it in quite as succinctly as you've just done right there. So, and they're very appreciative of that. So that's great. We've got a question about whether we're conducting conciliations in every city. Mostly for the overwhelming number of our conciliations are conducted over the phone at the moment. We call it mostly a telephone conciliation conference. There are rare occasions where we will conduct one in person. But so everyone's aware of some of the technologies that we're looking at the moment. We want to have a think about whether we should be introducing some sort of face-to-face contact. That might take the form of a video conferencing type of format in the future. It is in its infancy at the moment, so I certainly wouldn't make any promises that that's what we would be doing, but that's something that we would be looking at the moment and something that we would consider going forward. And we certainly take the feedback on board that it is important to have that face-to-face contact in certain situations. And again, we'll come back to that refrain. It's a case-by-case basis, and please let us know if you think it would be particularly useful, and that's something that we can certainly consider.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a question about how legalistic you intend a conciliation to be, or maybe how legal a conciliation gets when a solicitor is representing a complainant. So that's an interesting question. San, can you talk about how we might approach that?
Yeah, so it's always prefaced at the beginning of a conference that this is meant to be an open and informal chat between the parties. So by introducing the conference and the manner in which we introduce our conferences and we speak to the parties, it hopefully sets the tone for the parties about how the conference should really flow and what level we should be really speaking at. But sometimes what I might do as a conciliator is to ask parties, especially if there are lawyers involved, or sometimes even if at financial firms, if things get a little bit too technical, is to just break it down for me and to tell me, as if I'm not aware of this product or I'm not aware of this issue, how would you explain it? And maybe reflection is also a good tool that Alexandra talked about. If you could reflect on what they've said and I guess paraphrase what's been said and then break it down that way too. And the uses of silence as well, so pauses in the conference is very useful to kind of move things and I guess give the parties an opportunity to just get up to speed on what is going on. I find a great way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we'd encourage the parties really to try to avoid too much legal jargon, particularly in the joint session. If there's specific case law, for example, that you think is really relevant to a complaint, perhaps give the conciliator a heads up in individual session. And if that's something that they need to hand on to the case worker to look into further, or whether they need to sort of sound out with the other party, they're then able to make those judgments about how best to put what otherwise might be a bit technical and overwhelming.
Great. We've had a couple of questions come through about something that's perhaps not squarely in the conciliation space, but because I've seen a couple of questions, it might be worth addressing.
Okay.
It's about this point about if a complainant hasn't raised a complaint with AFCA, and they come with the financial firm, and they come directly to AFCA, would we refer that back to the financial firm or not?
In most instances, yes. There is an IDR period. So for superannuation complaints, that's a 90-day IDR period. IDR stands for Internal Dispute Resolution Period. For other complaints, it's 45 days. There are some circumstances where AFCA does have the scope to waive an IDR period if we choose to exercise our discretion to do that. Will ordinarily allow a greater period of time for response to the initial letters once it's at complaint management, to give firms the opportunity to do that sort of background work that can sometimes take time. To give you an idea of the times that usually happens, it's usually if there's a joinder of complaints or something like that. So the party might have brought the complaint against a particular financial firm, and in the course of investigating the complaint, we've realised another firm really needs to be joined to that. And we don't want to then be, really stalling the whole process by going back for a full IDR period. But we'll have an open dialogue with you about that. And if at any time you feel like you don't have enough time or need more time, it's a conversation to have with your caseworker, and we're open always to considering the individual circumstances.
Great. We've had a question about whether we publish any data about the number of complaints that are resolved by a payment from a financial firm to a complainant, and perhaps I'll take that one and say, no, we don't publish data about that case, that sort of situation specifically. We do publish data about the number of complaints that we find are resolved with a conciliation being conducted, and you can read that data in our annual report from last year. The figure for the period 2017 to 2018, the most recent reporting period, was 39%. 39% of complaints we found where conciliation was conducted resolved within 2 weeks of that conciliation being conducted. But I'd direct you to the annual report to read more about that. So we've had a pre-submitted question about perhaps about joinders. Alexandra, maybe I can pass to you on this one. There's been a question from a broker about if I've done everything right within the policy and within time, but the bank has caused issues along the way, will I be involved in the conciliation? Would you get me involved?
To reiterate what Sam's been saying a little bit, it depends. It's case by case. So it really depends on how cut and dry the situation is. If it's really clear, there's just clearly delineated two potentially separate complaints, then no. But if there's potential overlap, and certainly there's allegations coming from maybe the other financial firm, and we really do need to investigate that in order to work that out, then that's when we might look at joinder. But oftentimes we don't necessarily have to make a decision on joinder prior to the conciliation conference. There are times when it's really obvious that joinder is going to be on the cards. One example is when an advisor moves licensees and there's advice spanning a longer period. They tend to result in a joinder. Oftentimes we might just have two different complaints and we link them. We'll seek the parties' consent to have a joint conciliation conference to deal with the complaint more efficiently and holistically. And it may be that the information from that conciliation really informs whether it appears to be appropriate to join or not. But as always, there will be an ongoing conversation with both parties if joinder is a potential or is on the cards.
Great. We've had a question from Chantal about new issues raised in a conciliation, and saying, I'm wondering if you can address this. So does AFCA require financial firms to provide new submissions on a new issue? Is the financial firm allowed to refer to the fact that that issue was disclosed in the conciliation in their submissions. Perhaps a simple way of putting that is, would we consider new issues raised in a conciliation?
Yeah, of course. So, as we discussed before, as to where conciliations sit in the AFCA process, it is squarely in the case management space, and so any new information that's still received during that time can be considered up until a preliminary assessment or a recommendation, or if necessary, a determination is made. So if there is new information, and as I've indicated previously, if there is new information that's disclosed during a conciliation conference, this will be acknowledged by the conciliator. It will be noted as well on the file. So any new information will be raised with the caseworker moving forward should the matter not be resolved. And so it can be taken into consideration moving forward. As to whether you need to make written submissions on the new issue, which has already been verbally raised, I always encourage parties to put everything in writing as well, so that it's in an easy format to exchange between the parties. And given that the decision maker ultimately might not have been involved in the conciliation conference, and despite having access to the notes, it's always worthwhile having it put in your words. So if you choose to write your own submissions on that issue, it's probably best that you put it in your own words rather than just relying on what we might record in our notes, to put your best foot forward in terms of any kind of movement forwards in the investigation and the decision making of a complaint.
Great.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, and it just makes sure that every party has the opportunity to properly consider their response to any new issues that are raised.
Absolutely. So we've got a yes/no question from David. Does AFCA cover business banking customers? Alexandra, I'm wondering if you can respond to that.
Yes. We have a small business jurisdiction, so I think it's small businesses now defined under the new rules to up to 100 employees. So where that is the case, as long as it falls within our jurisdiction, the nature of the complaint falls within our jurisdiction, then yes, we will be considering those complaints.
Probably getting to the bounds of my understanding, but I do understand with lenders that only provide commercial credit, they're not required to be a member of the AFCA scheme. But that's something that I think there might be some legislated changes coming up about that as well. That's sort of a specific case and probably doesn't apply to most of the people that are here.
Yeah, I think there's a few things where it's a little bit of a moving feast at the moment. There's obviously, as you'd all be aware, a fair amount going on in the space, and I think it's something that we'll see changing quite a lot over the next few months, years.
Great. A question from Dan. Is there an intention to drive more conciliation calls to better manage the spike in complaints that AFCA has received now? It's a great question, Dan. It's certainly, again, it's something that we're looking at, and we have hugely increased the number of conciliations we conducted at AFCA. Looking at the numbers recently, we conducted 80% more conciliations in the month of March 2019 than we conducted in the month of March 2018. So there has been a huge push for conciliations. We do see it as a very important part of our process, and certainly something that we are focusing on as one of the many measures that we're putting in place to address the number of complaints that are coming in the door.
I think it ties in also, Julian, sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt. It also ties into why we're doing the conciliation accreditation program, so that there are more skilled workers in AFCA who can conduct conciliation conferences, so that we can provide the service as quickly as possible and as necessary in all the complaints that do come across our table.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the really big thing is that we find that regardless of whether a complaint resolves at conciliation or not, even if it goes the whole way through to a decision and a party gets a decision that's not in their favour, they're far more likely to have been satisfied with the whole process if they've had a conciliation at some stage. So we think it really goes to the heart of that question of being heard and being understood, and that's the key reason we really want to be driving greater use of conciliation.
Jason's asked a question, and it has come through in another couple of questions before, and it's worth perhaps spending a bit of time on it, which is about the confidentiality of information in a conciliation conference. And Jason asked, are matters discussed at conciliation confidential as they are in a mediation? Alexandra?
No, is the short answer. So It's without prejudice, which means that anything raised in the conciliation conference can't be used in any future legal proceedings, but certainly within AFCA, we will take notes of the conciliation conference. Now, one of the main reasons that we're doing that is because we find that it just really assists with the resolution of the complaint going forward. One of the main reasons for having a conciliation is it can really pull out what the underlying interests are. Sometimes it refocuses us on what the complaint's really about. Sometimes people aren't really sure about what's driving their complaint until they have that opportunity to unpack it and talk about it. So in making sure that those notes are being recorded and handed on just assists everyone in being more effectively able to address the complaint going forward and make sure that we're really looking at what we need to be looking at. Oftentimes, it'll be the case handler who's conducting the conciliation. It's not necessarily going to be a specialist conciliator who's separate to the complaint. So they'll be privy to all of the information that's come out in any event, and it just makes it a really good reference point going forward.
Yes. Just looking at another question here. We've had a couple of questions about costs, and it's worth addressing that. Given the nature of this forum is mixed complainants and financial firms, we won't be addressing costs here. If you do have any questions if any members have questions, they can direct those to the finance team at AFCA. I'd recommend you have a look at those resources that are on the member services portal, which will be able to answer any questions about costs in general at AFCA. So someone's asked, as a follow-up, I think, Alexandra, to what you were saying, does this mean that we can also record the conciliation?
No, is the short answer. We really do request that parties don't record the conciliation conference, and the reason for that is because we want it to be informal. As soon as the record button is hit, I think people are going to get their backs up, they're going to be a bit more positional, they're going to be a lot more careful. We really want it to be a very informal and free-flowing conference. When we say that we record the notes, we're really saying this was the opening, key points from the opening statements, this is the agenda, and under each agenda item we might have sort of a nutshell paragraph of these are the key things that came out. It's not intended to be recording real gotcha moments that are going to turn and change things too dramatically. If we feel that new information comes out during the conference that will really impact on a final decision or determination, we'll be having a chat to you about that and talking about it with you. But certainly having a recording from either side is something that we don't allow because it just puts people a bit too on edge and would be a very significant roadblock.
That's right. So we've got a question sort of process-wise, maybe Sam, you can address. Why would a conciliation be scheduled if the firm has requested the rules team have a look at it to determine whether it's in jurisdiction? Is that a situation where we'd go ahead and conduct a conciliation anyway?
Yeah, I keep on harping back to this, but it does depend case by case. And there have been occasions where we will still conduct a conciliation conference because the information that can be gathered during a conference may inform that kind of decision as well as to whether we do have jurisdiction or not. So it just really depends on what's being revealed, what information has been gathered before the conference, and whether that decision can be ultimately made before we go to a conciliation. And we would be, loath to miss the opportunity to have a conciliation conference just because of, I guess, a technicality around whether we do have jurisdiction or not. And at the end of the day, the conference is still an opportunity for the parties to understand each other's perspectives a little bit more, and it could help if there is a jurisdictional argument or objection for the reasons behind that to be discussed. So there's always a good chance that the conciliation can assist with those factors, I find.
Great. Does AFCA make a ruling on monetary compensation if a complaint is found in favour of the complainant?
So this is really if something goes through to a preliminary assessment or to a final determination.
I think so.
Then yes, we will be doing loss calculations and working out a monetary figure that needs to be paid in those instances. We have specialist internal resources that we often use, loss calculation specialists who can do a lot of modelling that assists us with that, but there will be a set amount.
Great. We've had a question from Sean about what percentage of conciliations are actually successful in a scenario where neither party has shown any indication of changing their position. Perhaps I could take that one and say, it's a real interesting concern that we have. If everyone comes into a conciliation with the idea, no, we're not budging on this, can we still go ahead? I think that's really what we're getting at. And where we've come through in our conciliation journey is we used to come at conciliation with this approach that, is this matter appropriate for conciliation or not? And we had a bit of a review about our process a couple of years ago, and we conducted a pilot, and that pilot was called the Conciliation Required Step Pilot. We had some of our largest members participate in a pilot program where we started with a different starting point, a different assumption, which is, why shouldn't we conduct the conciliation? Why not? And what we found is, so in the pilot, what we did was that we made it a required step that a conciliation had to be conducted, regardless of whether we thought it would be useful or not. What we found was we're worse at deciding at whether a conciliation is appropriate to conduct or not, because the resolution rate for those matters in the pilot was not significantly less than non-pilot disputes, which would suggest that overall the pilot was working. There were other benefits that we saw as well, like the amount of time that a conciliation was with FOS at the time was less if a conciliation was conducted, and the overall satisfaction rate, if a conciliation was conducted or not, was much higher. So we've changed that model. We've changed that assumption about whether a conciliation will be successful, making that judgment before we go into the conciliation itself. What we do is we'll go for the conciliation, we'll conduct the conciliation, and we'll see what happens. Yeah. And often the results are very surprising.
Yeah, that's right.
So Steve has asked, and it's a good question about whether, again, it's a process question, not squarely in, but it's worth touching on, whether IDR, internal dispute resolution process, can be dispensed with entirely in certain circumstances. Alexandra, is that something you could address?
Dispute resolution process dispensed with entirely. So are we really saying there that we bypass any sort of looking at negotiating or conciliating or anything like that? Not wanting to harp on the same thing, but it is case by case. It would be very much the exception and not the rule. There might be, really particular circumstances in a complaint where it's just not suitable, where time might be of the essence. Sometimes we have life insurance complaints or things where someone doesn't have a lot of time, and for a number of reasons things need to be expedited to a decision. Sometimes there's an issue where a financial firm might be in difficulty and it's considered appropriate that things go directly to a decision without any protracted sort of negotiation or conciliation step. So I think those are some examples of when we might do that, but let me emphasise it's very much the exception and not the rule.
Great. Well, Paul has asked a question about situations where a complainant has been unable to attend a conciliation. He would ask, well, why are we progressing the file to the next stage when the conciliation call can't go ahead or has to be rescheduled to meet their availability? Can you talk us through why we might do that?
Yeah, and again, case by case, I always say, but it does depend on how unavailable they are. So previously, a colleague of mine, a conciliator as well, had a complainant who had 2 rescheduled conciliation conferences, and the nature of that complainant's work was such that they were basically out on the tarmac of an airport, and so they had the sound in the background and they were not able to participate in the conference due to work commitments coming up at last minute. So unfortunately, in those circumstances, the conciliator tried and the caseworker tried twice to reschedule the conference, and it just could not go ahead. And so the next step was to progress it through our process because conciliation could not be done due to the availability of the complainant. However, again, it really depends on the case, Julian, and whether we are able to accommodate it. unfortunately, we are in quite high demand at the moment, and conciliators are pretty much fully booked. And so if a conciliation can't go ahead one day, then it would be a case of working with that conciliator or the rest of the conciliation team as to their availability on short notice to try and move the conciliation forward to another date. And if that can't be done for whatever reason, and this happens in life, that people can't be available for a sit down for a conference, then we might move to having to progress the complaint, unfortunately.
Yeah, at a certain point we have to take the practical approach and say it's not resolved, and we've got to move it on and keep on going through a process. We appreciate that can be really disappointing for financial firms as well. You may have been waiting for a long time. You may have done a lot of preparation for the day. It cuts both ways. It does happen sometimes that financial firms are not available at the time as well. We will call it as it is, and we'll do what's necessary to keep on considering the complaint in the best and most efficient way that we can.
That's right.
We've got a question from Nikki about the disclosure of documents and whether AFCA can compel a financial firm to disclose documents in our process. Alexandra, I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
So AFCA is now financial firms are now required by legislation to participate in the process and to provide information that we've requested. We don't have the power to go in and storm people's offices. If we are requesting financial firms to provide what we consider to be relevant information and they don't provide it, we are then able to draw an adverse inference from the fact that they haven't provided that information. That means we will draw an inference that they haven't provided it because it does not support them or is not beneficial to them, and that may lead to the decision being swayed in favour of the complainant. Given that it's now enshrined in legislation, failure to comply with requests for information may also lead to systemic issues reporting for financial firms, and that's something that can be followed up with ASIC.
Great, thanks for that. One final question. I think the questions have started to tail off, which is great. Hopefully we've addressed a number of the concerns, but maybe one question from Lucia. Who schedules the conciliations? San, can you just tell us about who schedules those conciliations?
Well, like we were talking about before, in the AFCA process, conciliations are conducted during the case management space. So usually it would be a caseworker who's had an initial call with both parties who attempts to make the scheduling of the conciliation conference. Like I said before, if that's not possible, then there may be a chance that if at a conciliation either party becomes unavailable, then the conciliator might be involved in any kind of rescheduling of the conference if necessary. But usually that's a task that's taken care of by our caseworkers at AFCA. And it's a discussion piece always between the parties about when they are available and when they're not. And usually it'll be confirmed in writing in one of our first letters if there is a date that can be confirmed.
Great. Well, thanks very much for that. That brings us to the end of today's webcast. I'd like to finish here first by thanking the panel, Alexandra Sidoti and San Lam. Thank you very much for joining us today. And also thank you to the audience for your participation. We hope you found the content useful and informative. Have a great day.